Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Thursday saw hundreds of thousands protest and strike across France in order to pressure the country's newly appointed Prime Minister, President Macron. The new PM faces a turbulent start with the disruptions as he inherits a fractured parliament and a ballooning deficit. We'll now examine the origins of the widespread protests over austerity measures, their social and economic impact, and discuss the challenges ahead for the Prime Minister. Now, welcome our guest, Dennis Kolesnyk, the President of MENA Research Center. Good to have you on the program. And let's start with these protests. I mean, the organizers said there were 1 million all across France. The fact is there were hundreds of thousands. So what kind of signal does that send, not just to the new Prime Minister, but to the French government and to Europe?
Hello, thank you for having me. And answering your question, we have to understand that since the snap election of last year, Emmanuel Macron didn't manage to have the results he has hoped for. I mean, to increase his positions of his party's position and to have the ruling majority. So for the last year, we've seen it is already the third Prime Minister, President Macron, former Minister of Defense. And as you know, that Belarus government has prepared the draft budget with around 44 billion of welfare and social benefits related cuts. And he has faced the vote of, he has failed. I mean, he was ousted by the vote of non-confidence in the parliament. And this protest also goes in line with the sending the message to the new prime minister and the government he will create, because the government is not yet created, and to reconsider those kind of austerity budget. But the problem arises with the fact that in France we have 114% of GDP, of debt-to-GDP ratio, and we have roughly 5.5% of budget deficit, which is impossible to continue this way. And the problem is that with the current political instability and without the majority in the parliament, it will be quite difficult for President Macron to navigate and to look for compromises.
Right. You mentioned an interesting phrase there. It's impossible to continue this way. You said the economic woes that are plaguing France right now. Also, I think it was the 5.8% GDP deficit, which is double of what's actually allowed in the European Union. So it can't continue this way. But if we look on the streets, I mean, the images we're seeing now, hundreds of thousands of people. This is also following last week's protests of Block Everything, Blockade 2. So, but it's impossible. It needs to be done. So what do you think the new Prime Minister and his government could do differently?
I guess the new government, and yes, you're right, it's rather 5.8 than 5.5, as I said. But for the new Prime Minister, President Macron, I guess his move, it will be trying to find first of all, to create a government, and secondly, to try to find the compromise with mostly leftists and the La France Insoumise Mélenchon supporters. And we know that the left spectrum of French politics has capitalized on this, on yesterday's manifestations. And it is obvious that some kind of concessions should be made for his government to continue. But at the same time, even if he will present the same budget or the slightly adopted budget, maybe with only slight compromises, most likely he will face the same destiny as his predecessor. So I guess we are in kind of a deadlock currently, and it will be difficult to navigate this.
Right. And I think let's also see how we arrived here, because I mean, we see the protests now, we're wondering but this has been an ongoing journey. You said several prime ministers already. If we're looking at the numbers as well, France is spending about 400 billion euros annually on pensions. So that's a huge chunk. And if we're looking at part of GDP, I think that's about 12% of France's GDP, one of the highest, if not the highest, in the European Union. So if we're looking at this, how did we get to this point, and what kind of reform let's say, will be digestible for the French people?
I mean, one of the reasons that sparked the discontent was the idea to untie the pensions, the inflation to the pension, which means the pensions the proposed bill was suggesting that the pensions will not be tied to inflation, which means no by default increase in pensions, which would drastically impact the retirees. But I guess there will be on one side the propositions somehow that will be seen by the people. I mean, populist propositions actually to, for example, and we've seen it already, we've heard it already. For example, to put an end to some kind of benefits for the politicians, for the ex-politicians that are still continue to receive their benefits, and it was announced by Sébastien Lecornu. So it's kind of a populist move that will not definitely help with the budget deficit, but will at least be liked by some of the protesters and some of the people who are angered with the current government and the previous governments, and generally with the Emmanuel Macron's political system that he has created. And speaking more broadly, I would say that most likely after the 2027, we'll be going back to the two-party, if you want, system that existed prior to Emmanuel Macron's arrival in power in 2017, when he basically managed to destroy or at least decrease the power of the weight of the right and the left, and created this some kind of a middle. And back then it was an interesting move, but right now we see that it is not working.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then also, as we know, this is going to be a very fractured parliament. This is something that already brought down the previous prime minister. So, I mean, the question now is not to be too much about what will happen, but the left and the far right, I mean, what their proposals in all this, are they any more, let's say, reasonable, or is this all just populist rhetoric?
You know, as of today, and as you have rightly said, the parliament is fractured and there is no change with this regard. And the far-right Rassemblement National support is growing, and it's more than 30% right now. It's the biggest public support of a political party in France right now. And Emmanuel Macron's, for example, support is down to 14-15%. For obvious reasons, far left Jean-Luc Mélenchon and far right Marine Le Pen try to capitalize on the government's inability and Emmanuel Macron's inability to properly govern the country. And one of the most parties who will benefit, in my opinion, still remains Rassemblement National, while Jean-Luc Mélenchon manages to capitalize on the protesters, capitalize on the, on this agenda that we have to keep all the welfare state and the benefits, which is impossible given the economic situation of France.
Right. I mean, this is flared up before. I mean, if we talk about the welfare state, this is something very dear to many French people. But at the same time, I mean, there will be internal pressures. Also, if we're looking at markets outside, we have the European Union influence here. How much of this really is up to the French people themselves? And how much does France have to follow in line with European pressures on all this? I mean, this is also credibility for France as a reliable market. So how much pressure is going to be on that front?
And I guess you have seen that Fitch agency has decreased France's rating from A- to A+, which will make borrowing money on the international market even harder, with a bigger interest rate for France. And generally speaking, the financial situation, we already actually have a bigger, almost twofold bigger deficit than it is allowed by the European Union Treaty of 3%, And given this the situation, it is important, in my opinion, for the government to talk to the people and to have a real conversation explaining that it is simply impossible to keep up with the welfare state as it used to be, that the reforms should be done, that maybe unpopular moves should be done, and it is for a better good for our children, if you want, because if we continue this way, at some point we will be stuck with a situation where we still have to fund the defense, given the Russian threat and the growing instability on the, geopolitical instability, if you want. But at the same time, we have to finally manage our internal situation, which also, when we give promises that France will be engaged, for example, on the eastern flank of NATO, that France is a reliable partner, it is the message we are sending. It is the message.
Yeah, the message is going to be a very difficult message. Sorry to interrupt you there, but as you said, it goes into many things. Yes. What happens in France on the budget, but also in defense and reliability. It's going to be a very emotional debate indeed. Look, we'll, of course, cover it more. We'll close it there. Thank you so much. That was our guest there today, Denis Kolesnyk. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching World Talks, but stay tuned. Much more coming up right here on TVP World. Goodbye.